Thank you to everyone for joining us, and welcome to the latest Duke University media briefing. I'm Allison Jones with Duke University Communications. So on October 31st, world leaders gather in Glasgow for the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, known as COP26. The gathering comes at a critical moment in the struggle against climate change. With us today to discuss COP26, climate change, and a key contributor to climate change, methane, are Drew Shindell and 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐏𝐚𝐬. Drew Shindell is Nicholas Distinguished Professor of Earth Science at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. He studies climate change, air quality, and links between science and policy. He previously served at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. He has testified on climate change before both houses of Congress, and he chairs the Scientific Advisory Board for the International Climate and Clean Air Coalition. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐏𝐚𝐬 is director of the Climate and Energy Program at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, and she's a senior lecturer at Duke Law School. Her work focuses on public electric utility regulation, electricity market reforms, and effective governance of unconventional oil and gas production and transport. She previously served as Chief Environmental Counsel to U.S. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse and as an environmental enforcement trial attorney at the U.S. Department of Justice. Thank you both for joining us today. So efforts to stem climate change have long focused on carbon dioxide, and now another greenhouse gas, methane, is also getting more attention. Professor Shindell, what's the role of methane emissions in climate change, and how does that differ from carbon dioxide?
Yes, thank you, Allison, and thanks to all who are tuning in to this today. So methane is the second most important of the greenhouse gases. It's driven nearly half the warming that we've seen to date. And one of the things that's really different about it compared to carbon dioxide is the lifetime. Methane doesn't stay in the atmosphere for nearly as long as carbon dioxide. So that kind of has pros and cons when you think about the role of the two in our future. We very critically need to start reducing our carbon dioxide now because it lasts so long, and precisely because it lasts for hundreds or even many hundreds to thousands of years in the atmosphere. If we don't start putting the brakes on CO2 emissions this decade, we are in for a rather dismal looking future. At the same time, though, since it's such a slow part of climate change, if we put the brakes on, we still are not going to see all that much impact on the climate in the next 30 years or so. And so that's really where methane, while it's number two, plays an extremely complementary role to targeting CO2. Because if we put the brakes on methane emissions, since it doesn't last in the atmosphere so long, and it's a very powerful greenhouse gas, we can actually start putting the brakes on damages from climate, the kinds of things like the wildfires, the hurricanes, the heat waves that are falling upon us. So with all too often these days, we can actually put the brakes on those in the next 20 to 30 years. So that really gives methane a distinct and differentiated but highly complementary role to CO2 in the climate story.
Thank you so much. That's somewhat encouraging. Professor 𝐏𝐿𝐴, why are methane emissions beginning to attract more attention now?
Great question, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's an honor to do anything with Dr. Shindell, so great to be here, and welcome to all who are listening. I would say there's a few reasons why methane has really captured our attention in recent years. One is just the science has gotten so much better, and that's done two things. It's made us realize that methane is a bigger issue than we previously thought in a number of key industries like oil and gas, coal mining, agriculture, and landfills. It's also the new technology that scientists have been deploying are enabling us to see what was an invisible pollution issue often for a very long time. I was really struck by, I've been working on methane for a number of years, but the end of 2019, the New York Times did an interactive story where they used infrared cameras and went over oil and gas facilities, and they had this in their online paper. And the number of people I know who came to me to talk about methane and ask about methane really increased after that. That really did seem to tell a compelling story by showing people the pollution that previously they may have driven by and not realized was there. Similarly, at the end of 2019, there was a paper that came out in Geophysical Letters of satellite images of just a massive methane leak in Turkmenistan, something that had gone completely under the radar until we had these technologies to find it and attribute it to particular sources on the ground so that it had to be addressed. So I think that's one of the big reasons. The other thing is, and maybe hoping we can continue on the optimistic line here. There's not always a lot to be optimistic about in the climate change space, but methane is, of course, also the primary constituent of natural gas. And so in this case, this pollution is also a useful product. Because of that, a lot of the cost-benefit analyses done of intervening and stopping leaks and plumes of methane, then realize you can often then sell that methane into the market. And because of that, you can often do some of these mitigation interventions at no cost. And even at net benefit to the company that's plugging those leaks, for instance. And so this can be a very cost-effective, and I guess I'm particularly thinking the oil and gas space, a cost-effective way to address climate change and to mitigate greenhouse gases quickly in the near term.
Fantastic. Thank you both for those comments. So we'll take questions now, and thank you to those who submitted questions in advance. You can also pose questions via the Q&A window at any time. And if you're calling in by phone, you could raise your hand by pressing *9. And thanks also to those who are watching on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. So back to the two of you. Let's talk just a little bit about this moment. COP26 is less than 2 weeks away. Professor Shindell, how critical is this upcoming international gathering to the fight against climate change, and why is it important to move the needle at this moment?
Well, I'd say it's really important because, I've been working on climate modeling and projecting our future for decades. And when I started doing this, we were really just thinking about things that would happen in the distant future. And, if we ran a model in the 90s, there are all these things to worry about somewhere down the line. Now that we're in the 2020s, the things we worry about are in the newspaper rather than our future projections. They are California burning and much of the West burning, and heat domes, and they are the hurricanes that hit in our part of the country. And they're just so manifest that I think we've run out of time to say, well, we'll get to this a little later. We'll make agreements and pledges that sometime down the road we'll start taking action. And so I'd say that at this point, it is really critical to start putting the brakes on both CO2 and methane. And if we don't, we will very rapidly lose all hope of keeping temperatures below 1.5. We're already at about 1.2 degrees. The temperatures are warming at a rate of on the order of a couple tenths of a degree per decade. That gives us, at the most, maybe 20 years or so, and we will have passed the thresholds, which all of the scientific research define as already mildly catastrophic, but better than getting to temperatures of 2 or 2.5 or 3 degrees. So we've really run out of time. We need to take action right away. We talk about the total amount of carbon we can emit, and we're running out of that budget. And there's only a couple decades left. So we need to start bringing fossil fuels out of the mix. And at the same time, as Kate was just talking about, what fossil fuels we are using, especially oil and gas, we want to make sure that they're used efficiently. We don't want to be leaking methane from those systems. And then we have the other sectors of methane, agriculture, the waste sector. We can and we really must make a difference within this decade in order to avoid going past these kind of dangerous guardrails that the whole world has ostensibly agreed we want to keep below in the Paris Climate Agreement, but we're not really putting that into practice yet.
So meanwhile, at this critical moment that you've just very vividly described, the Biden administration's climate proposals seem to me meeting pretty stiff headwinds in Congress. How important is it, this to the two of you, how important is the action in Congress or lack thereof for the success of this international gathering?
Yeah, well, I mean, you saw last week, there was a difference of opinion even within the White House on this, with former Secretary John Kerry saying that this was a disaster if we didn't get across the finish line a large infrastructure bill and the climate reconciliation package before the COP. And then Biden sort of stepping in quickly and saying that was hyperbole and not as, the stakes were not as high as Kerry would have it. I think there is a lot of consternation in the administration about not having that deal in hand, that having a multi-trillion-dollar package focused on climate change mitigation and adaptation would be a strong signal to the global community just before this UN convening. I do think, though, it is not the whole ball of wax. We were never going to get tough limits in these budget and infrastructure packages on greenhouse gases, methane or carbon dioxide. Even if they got across the finish line, the clean electricity standard, it was really more of a carrots program rather than any sort of hard limits. And so we always were going to have to pair those investments with real regulatory standards. And so I think what the Biden administration can also point to going into the COP are the proposals that EPA is churning out, and I expect we should see one on methane for new and existing oil and gas infrastructure this week or next. So certainly before the COP coming out of EPA. And those types of signals showing that in addition to any investment package that may or may not cross the finish line in Congress this session, in addition, there are these regulatory levers that the Biden administration is willing to pull to limit greenhouse gases, including methane.
Great point. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Professor Shindell.
Yeah, well, I am like the White House, perhaps a little bit of two minds and going back and forth between being very disappointed and worried and hopeful that there are other options on the table. And so I am quite convinced that the administration is in good faith trying to do all they can, and that they have some wonderful people on board. And I do think that they will find a way, regardless of what happens with the budget reconciliation discussion, to make good progress. You know, it might not be as much as we would ideally want, but in the methane space in particular, you know, the US has been one of the countries spearheading a new global push to bring down methane, which is something really unprecedented. We haven't had this focus on methane, as you brought up, in Allison, in the opening question, you know, and that's something that is I think a fantastic step forward. And like much of what goes on when countries make pledges or commit to long-term targets, or businesses or states or anybody, these are often very far in the future. But that's another thing that I think is really powerful about methane, is they're making commitments to have major reductions in less than 10 years. So it's not really that far away. And I think, as Kate said, you know, that we'll be able to tell when we see regulations coming out, if there are new standards for oil and gas operators, for example. That will go a long way towards convincing the world that the US is on track to meet this new methane pledge. So I'm still cautiously optimistic that if it doesn't get done through the budget process, that the administration will be creative and find other ways.
So I want to hear a little bit more about why the two of you are somewhat optimistic about the potential for reducing methane. First of all, Professor Shindell, what are some of the benefits that would come from reducing methane emissions?
Yeah, so methane is a really interesting gas. If I can become, you know, too much of an atmospheric scientist and get excited about a particular molecule, but unlike many of the other pollutants that I have spent a long time studying, and most of my colleagues have also spent decades looking at. Methane plays a major role in climate change as it's a powerful greenhouse gas, but it also is one of the main precursors to surface level ozone. And just to avoid confusion, ozone up in the stratosphere is good for us. It keeps UV radiation from bombarding the surface. But ozone near the ground is not just not good for us, it's very, very bad for us. And ozone is one of the main components of smog. When people breathe that in, there are definitive epidemiological studies linking that to increased death from cardiovascular disease, from respiratory disease, from multiple toxicities of ozone exposure. It's also bad for crops. Ecosystems don't like being exposed to ozone either. So if we were, for example, to meet the goals of this methane pledge and reduce methane worldwide by on the order of 30%, we would around the world be saving on the order of a couple 100,000 lives every year from reduced ozone exposure. We'd have on the order of 20 million more tons of crop yields to feed people around the world. We would have increased labor productivity because neither extreme heat nor ozone exposure are good for workers. And of course, we would start seeing a reduction compared to what they would have been of all of the climate damages that are coming upon us. The other thing that we can talk a little bit more about is depending on what you do to prevent methane from getting to the atmosphere. Let's say you are putting in methane capture at a landfill. You not only have all of these benefits for the environment, but you now have a source of energy that you didn't have before, right? That all of that decomposing organic stuff that's releasing methane from the landfill can now be a source of electricity. And especially in developing countries where there's very little control of methane from the waste sector currently, and there's a desperate need for sources of electricity, this can really provide tremendous local benefit. So there are a lot of kind of win-win-wins. I don't even know how many wins to go down the line with from methane controls.
Fantastic. Professor 𝐏𝐚𝐧𝐞𝐏, I wanted to follow up with you regarding the cost effectiveness of controlling methane emissions. You touched on that a little bit earlier, and Professor Shindell touched on this, but can you say a little bit more about why it can be cost effective to try to reduce methane emissions? And how?
Sure. There's sort of two pieces to that. One is that, say you look at a oil and gas well pad. One of the challenges of methane, and I'll focus right now on methane from oil and gas infrastructure, is that, this is not like a coal-fired power plant where you've got this large boiler and you have a smokestack coming out of it, and the vast majority of emissions are coming through that smokestack, which, by the way, in the United States has a continuous emissions monitor on it, so you know exactly what's coming out. One of the challenges of methane is that it can be leaking and being vented. It can be released from a whole host of pieces of equipment, as many as thousands of pieces of equipment at a single well pad. And so that makes it challenging. On the flip side, if you are able to plug those leaks, if you are able to capture methane when you are completing a well or doing well maintenance, when you would normally let that methane vent for safety reasons, you can actually draw it off with a vapor recovery system and put it back into your gathering lines and send it off to the sales lines. You have the opportunity, as Dr. Shindell said, to turn that waste product into your sales product, because again, methane is the primary constituent of natural gas. And so you can then use it for sale. There's sort of a general statistic floating out there that about 40% of the interventions you could do at oil and gas, along the oil and gas value chain to plug leaks or otherwise stop methane venting or releases, could pay for itself in terms of then selling that natural gas that you've captured. Industry can push back on that. It certainly depends on where you are. For instance, in parts of the United States where the drilling is primarily for oil, we may not have gas gathering lines and enough infrastructure to be capturing that gas and getting it to market. which is a whole other really interesting question. But generally, there is some significant percentage of mitigation steps that you could take that would pay for themselves and that you then capture methane that you can sell as a useful product. The other sort of piece here about where this can be really cost effective is that when you're considering sort of methane across a supply chain and in determining how carbon intensive your product is, for instance, we're finding that a lot of buyers from the European Union to company buyers in East Asia are looking at the embedded emissions in LNG imports, for instance, and are really interested in buying as green of gas as they can. And in those cases, one, if they can show in a robust way that their supply chain has lower emissions because their upstream producers have taken these steps to mitigate methane leakage, they might be able to charge a green premium for their gas. So I think in those two ways, there's some value to be captured, economic value to be captured, in addition to all the environmental value of stopping these leaks and reducing methane emissions.
Great. So you began to touch on this, but can you say a little bit more about the sectors, the main sectors where methane is produced? We've touched on one here, being gas and the production of petroleum and natural gas. What are the other major sectors? I can throw that out to both of you.
Sure. Well, I mean, so it is primarily oil and natural gas and other fossil fuels as well. So coal production, from mine to mine, this depends, but often you have a lot of natural gas co-located with coal. And then agriculture. So you have either just the anaerobic organisms that are producing methane in the normal digestive process of cows and sheep and goats. You have animal waste that can emit methane. And then you have our waste as well. So landfills can also be a huge source of methane.
And does that, how does regulating methane emissions, this professor, for you, sticking with you, Professor 𝐏𝐏𝐿, how does regulating methane emissions differ from regulating CO2 emissions?
Yeah, well, I touched on this a little bit earlier. It tends to be that our CO2 emissions are coming from combusting fossil fuels. And so there's normally a somewhat contained system in which you have burned those fuels, and then there is a tailpipe on your car or a smokestack on your stationary source, your cement plant, your coal-fired power plant, other industrial sources, where you have, so you have relatively few emissions sources, right? So, and you sort of, you know where the emissions are going to come out. So it is easier to measure, and it is also easier to put end of the pipeline controls on to control for that pollutant. One of the things that is so challenging about methane is that it comes from many, many, many sources in these industries. It's often quite decentralized, geographically dispersed. I mean, think of cattle roaming lands, think of cattle in feedlots, think of the millions of miles of oil and gas transmission and distribution pipelines, think of all the wells, think of all the components at well sites. There are so many potentially emitting sources of methane. And so it can be really hard to get a handle on, both for determining the magnitude of emissions that we're dealing with, and then to come up with pollution control sort of strategies. So there isn't sort of a one put at the end of your tailpipe or your smokestack, one pollution control to add on and you can walk away and be done. It tends to require a lot of engineered solutions. So in the oil and gas space, it has to do with maintenance and inspection. It has to do with alarms to override operator error, like leaving a tank hatch open over the weekend. It's lots of different little things that can add up to quite big reductions in emissions, but you have to sort of know where to look, or you have to have the right engineering systems in place to reduce the opportunity for those leaks and vents in the first place.
Professor Shindell, can you say a little bit more about how methane is produced in these various sectors? We talked about three main sectors.
Sure. Yeah. So as Kate was describing, in the fossil fuel sector, it is typically leaks in the systems. In some cases, for safety reasons, there's deliberate venting to try to get rid of, say, methane in a coal mine, or high pressure at well completion. In agriculture and livestock, it is agriculture and waste, rather. It is microorganisms, and again, these are the microorganisms that live in the stomach of ruminant animals. Cattle are by far and away the largest source of methane. And the same kind of microbes live in anaerobic environments, meaning no oxygen present. When a landfill gets, a little bit of waste comes in and covers the previous layer, it doesn't get oxygen, it turns into a methane source. The same with manure in, say, a large livestock farm. Rice is one of the other ones where if you typically, traditional ways to flood the rice paddy, and then that layer of water prevents oxygen from getting to the soils down at the bottom. So again, methane emitting microbes thrive there. One of the other interesting consequences of methane having so many sources, though, and such disparate sources, is that, I think this is interesting in the sense that I think is part of the reason it might be easier sometimes to get international agreements, is that all countries of the world have large methane sources, right? And within the fossil fuel sector, that's confined to, several major countries. You could, the top dozen or so would dominate the total emissions from fossil fuels. But every country has agricultural sectors, and every country has waste. And interestingly, across economies, it turns out that the per capita organic waste is quite similar. We throw out a lot more plastic stuff and other disposable things in wealthy countries like the US than poorer countries do. But we all pretty much throw around about a similar amount of organics. So when you try to bring countries together to do something about methane, you don't, in my experience, get quite as much of the kind of finger pointing that you get with CO2 of, a poor country rightfully saying we're not responsible for climate change and our per capita emissions are very low, so you guys should take most of the action and we'll sit by. And and then they're saying, well, you're important now too, and all this back and forth. Whereas with methane, we all kind of need to come to the same table, and we all have our part to do. And we all get a lot of clear and immediate benefits because the response is so quick, especially from ozone. You start pulling down methane, and the ozone response and the public health and agricultural benefits from that occur very rapidly, the same year that you lower methane emissions, and they tend to be dominant in low latitude countries because, in addition to methane, you need sunlight to form ozone. And so that tends to be more powerful in low latitude countries. So it also helps bridge this kind of north-south divide that you see so often in the political discourse. So the plurality of methane sources makes observations and figuring out where to act a great challenge, but it makes, in some sense, the political agreements to act a little more possible.
That's so cool. How can we, this question for you, Professor 𝐏𝐚𝐧𝐞, how can we encourage companies to start capturing methane instead of releasing it? Is there a role for incentives? What are some of the tools that can be used?
Yeah, sure. And I also just wanted to put a pin in something that Dr. Shindell just said about the fast results you see from reducing methane emissions. I think that is hugely important. I mean, at the very top of this, he was talking about how we absolutely have to start reducing in drastic ways our carbon dioxide right now because it persists in the atmosphere for centuries. The flip side of that is even if we stopped emitting carbon dioxide today, the effects of what we've already loaded in the atmosphere we're stuck with for some time. And so what's interesting about methane is that we actually could see very quickly, in a matter of a few years, the results, the fruits of our labor, if we all sort of collectively work to reduce those emissions. And, we're a society, we like instant gratification. So hopefully small wins on methane would then get everybody sustained for the long haul on the carbon dioxide side of the ledger. So as far as what we can do with companies, this is a very robust discussion right now. There is certainly the view out there that you don't necessarily need more incentives because so much of these interventions pay for themselves. So there is the incentive on its own. You also often hear industry, and again, I'm thinking mostly in the oil and gas space, you see industry sort of making the argument sometimes that they don't need regulation because this is a no-brainer for us. Of course, we would limit methane emissions because we can then sell that useful product. The fact is we have a lot of methane emissions from the oil and gas sector. There are lots of reasons for that. There are some companies, and it generally tends to be larger companies that are vertically integrated, so they're brand names that that in recent years have taken this more seriously and have been taking steps to reduce their methane emissions. Often they have a footprint in countries that have required this or strongly incentivized this, and that has sort of helped them get a head start. But this is a really diverse industry. And in particular, in the US, we have an incredibly competitive landscape with the oil and gas industry and lots of smaller, undercapitalized players. And so they may make the argument that even if you take as true that 40% of the interventions will ultimately result in savings or even a profit because they can sell the gas that they capture, that's still, there are still opportunity costs there because they could have spent that money going and drilling several more wells. And in particular with unconventional, you make a lot more of your money in the first couple of years of production of a well. So there's this race to drill more. And so, yes, we need more than just the sort of natural incentives that you can capture this gas and then sell it. Also, as I mentioned, in some oil-heavy plays, there just isn't the gas infrastructure to collect it, so you might not be able to sell it. So then there's probably an array of strategies that we might deploy. This has been a big discussion in the infrastructure package and the climate reconciliation package on the Hill about whether there should be incentives for operators to reduce their methane emissions. There is the sort of philosophical debate about whether that is subsidizing the fossil fuel industry and therefore we shouldn't do it versus, hey, these small guys are otherwise probably not going to be reducing these emissions. So let's help them and sort of set morality aside here and just get the reductions out of the atmosphere. But then there is also this role for regulation, that it may just be that we have to increase the standards and sort of our sort of basic what we expect of an operator when they are drilling a well, completing a well, sending gas through the supply system. And then some combination of these things, the inherent value of this waste product as a useful product, some incentives to do more, and then some regulatory requirements that the combination of those should be able to really move the needle on this issue.
Terrific. So both of you have mentioned, yes, please go, please.
I was just going to jump in and say one additional thing is that, everything that Kate said lays out the landscape of the regulations and why sometimes incentives are needed and such. One thing that I find is encouraging about this is that, again, a little bit in contrast to some of the broader decarbonization, which is still playing out very slowly around the world. And there are places around the world with very low leak rates from their fossil and infrastructure, from oil and gas. And we can monitor from satellite now only the larger leaks. So it's, there still might be small ones that we're missing, but from satellites, we can see that when different jurisdictions have put into place a strong regulatory and or incentive platform set of policies, it really works. You can get the intensity of methane emissions per unit of fossil fuel produced down dramatically from what most notably the United States and Russia have as very, very high emission intensities for their current systems. A couple other countries that are, like Venezuela and Iran, but they have political issues. But as far as the biggest ones, the US and Russia really show incredible room for progress. So that's just an encouraging note.
Yes. What are some of the places that are doing a good job of reducing methane emissions?
Some of the places that show very little from space are many of the Persian Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain. It's a little hard to tell for some of the ones that are way out in the Gulf because the satellites have a tough time seeing over the ocean. But for onshore production, most of those regions seem to do a great job. And then you can even see pretty substantial differences across the United States. And again, this goes to what Kate was commenting on, that sometimes you really need good regulations. And we have states like Texas that promotes itself as being, business friendly, which seems to mean we have very few regulations and we're not going to pay much attention if you have a lot of leaks. So that Texas just shows up as kind of this glowing spot from space where there's so much natural gas pouring out that you'd think, wow, that could power a whole country for a year. And actually there's estimates that the US and Russian leaks actually could power several small countries for a year. So we have other states though that are almost invisible, almost dark from space, and yet they still have oil and gas infrastructure. So again, there's this big variety, but I take that as, to put a positive spin on that, it shows that when we put our minds to it, we can make this work well, and we can make it work well in places that still manage to have very high levels of profitable production.
Interesting. So both of you have mentioned waste in a few different ways. And by that, we're talking in part about landfills. Is that right? I wonder if you can both touch on how landfills contribute to this problem, and first how they contribute to the problem. Professor Shindell?
Well, landfills and waste in general is a sector that often doesn't come into the climate conversation because it's not a substantial source of carbon dioxide emissions. It leads to methane emissions and to a lesser extent nitrous oxide. But it is I forget the exact number, but it is not quite as large as agriculture, which is the #1 sector. Fossil is second, and waste is third, but still substantial. They're all kind of comparable in size, around 40, 30, 20% or so. And waste then is, as I mentioned before, is distributed around the world with ample room for places to make progress, especially in developing countries, but not only in developing countries. One of the most interesting scientific studies I've seen, in addition to the infrared camera example from the New York Times that Kate mentioned and the satellite studies, is some aircraft measurements where they're equipped with methane monitors and they've flown over landfills in California. And California has long had excellent regulations for landfills. And the problem is, again, as Kate was saying, that methane is invisible. So you can have great regulations, but if there's a cover across the landfill to capture all of the methane and then route it to a pipeline to be used, if that cover got damaged, or there's a tear in it, or the landfill is still active and there's a section where trucks are driving in and out and still dumping material, and that happens to be the highest point, and therefore all the methane flows up there, then despite the regulations, the practice turns out to be quite different. And the overflights in California found that most landfills were indeed similar to what the estimated emissions were, but some were 5, 6, 8 times larger than you'd expect. And so, and then in most developing countries, there are no regulations and no attempts made to catch the methane coming out of the waste sector and the landfills. So wastewater is another small component, but that tends to be fairly expensive to deal with. And the main reason you deal with that is, of course, water quality. But for landfills, they are like the kind of things Kate was talking about in the fossil sector, that often if you capture and use the energy, they'll pay back for themselves over a few years. In developing countries in particular, there is often a lack of capital to put into place the needed capture equipment. And sometimes there is lack of capacity to even manage the waste stream and bring all of the waste to one place. Sometimes it's even worse, and it's just burned, which is a terrible thing for air pollution as well as climate. So there is plenty to be done by exporting technical and financial assistance to developing countries. We have the technology, we have the know-how, but since it hasn't been really on the climate radar, it hasn't been part of international climate-related financial or technical development. And I think that's an area where if we get more involvement of the financial and climate-related development community, we could make a lot of progress.
Why is methane attracting more attention now? What has changed? That's a question for both of you.
Well, I can start, since at least on my screen I'm still highlighted, which is why I was waiting for you last time, Kate. You were up, so I figured you should go. On mine, I'm up. So I think that it's a confluence of several factors. It's our ability to see methane much more clearly with the latest generation of observations, which helps us know where to look and helps us realize that methane has several natural sources too, like natural wetlands, which are operating on the same principle as a rice paddy. It's often been very hard to tell what fraction of the total methane was coming from any individual source. It's still challenging, as Kate was talking about. They're so diffuse. There's so many cows and there's so many waste dumps and et cetera. So we have had a clearer understanding of just how much of the methane that is released to the atmosphere is human rather than natural in origin. That appears to be larger than we thought before. We have also seen methane in the atmosphere, its concentration, go from a period around 20 years ago where it was essentially flat. It was not rising. And so we were a little complacent about methane, thinking CO2 is really out of control and is going up very quickly, but at least methane is kind of under control. And now, in part because of the fracking boom, in part because of the ever increasing number of livestock and humans that drive the waste, the growth rate of methane is at record levels and is alarming people, at the same time that the impacts of climate change are alarming people. And so when we're looking for additional arrows for our quiver, as it were, to deal with this climate problem, methane suddenly appears as a much bigger player than I think was previously recognized.
That's great. Do you want to add to that, Professor 𝐏𝐚𝐧𝐞𝐥𝐢𝐬𝐭𝐬?
No, I mean, I think Dr. Shindell mostly covered it all. I guess I just wanted to make a little observation about something he had said earlier about when California was doing its survey of landfills and how most of them emitted what you would expect, and then some were emitting so much more. And just, I think that's worth emphasizing. It also gets at this question of why has this become important? We've actually seen in the US, I think it's been quite interesting how media has covered the very wonky science of methane in the last 10 years, as we've learned that a lot of the emission factors, the sort of assumptions that EPA uses in its greenhouse gas inventory are just wrong. And I think, just not, the issue with methane is that it's not sort of a steady state thing. And so it's very difficult to say, oh, you can expect this much methane is going to come out of this landfill or this leaky valve or this wellhead. It turns out that there's really broad distribution with very fat tails. And so it's hard to figure out exactly what the emissions are. And one of the ways that I think methane has been popularized in the last 10 years in the US is that there has been a lot of attention about a series of scientific papers really calling into question some of our assumptions about methane emissions, where, sort of here's what the inventory says, and then here's when we fly over the very same basin, it seems that there are 3, 4, 5 times as much methane, and then trying to figure out how to reconcile that. I've been really impressed, I think, by how much of that has filtered through into just the press. And so I do think there is sort of a raised level of awareness about the really pivotal role that methane plays in our climate mitigation strategy.
Another question for you, Professor 𝐏𝐏 𝐏𝐿. We've been talking about the 3 main sectors that are responsible for the bulk of methane emissions, those being petroleum and gas production on the one hand, waste, landfills, et cetera, on the other hand, and then finally agriculture. We haven't said as much about agriculture. I get the sense that that is a more difficult area to regulate. Can you explain why that is?
Yes, and I'll start with the caveat that I spend a lot more time focused on the oil and gas issues related to methane. But agriculture generally, having been an environmental lawyer before I was a climate change lawyer and really focused on the Clean Air Act, agriculture, first, just practically speaking, is even that much more decentralized. And certainly when you look around the world, for every one of our very concentrated feedlots, you have many, many subsistence farmers. So it's an incredibly decentralized activity. And many, many of the actors in it are grossly undercapitalized. And so, you're trying to figure out how to reach all of those agricultural sources can just from a practical perspective be incredibly challenging. From a regulatory perspective, and now I'm probably more focused in the United States, we have very much tied up in our culture this sort of sense of our agrarian past and how important that is. And that is very bound up in how we think about environmental regulation. So the agricultural industry enjoys a lot of exemptions from our federal environmental laws, making it just sort of a third rail in terms of environmental regulation, which just adds to the very practical challenges that you have here of addressing these sources of methane.
So a question for both of you. We've been talking about actions governments and businesses can take to reduce methane emissions and therefore to reduce their carbon footprint. What about individuals? What are some of the steps individuals can take to reduce their carbon footprint and specifically in regard to methane?
Well, I'm still highlighted, so I guess that under
Go for it.
Shindell hypothesis, I should keep going. Yes. So individual actions, I think there are certainly some consumption behaviors that people should consider, at least. I mean, given that we were talking about, as Drew said, per capita organic waste is pretty similar around the world. But we use a lot more plastic, which when it's landfilled emits a great deal of methane. We also eat a great deal of meat, and that certainly drives a lot of the methane. And so those two things are very practical personal choices that people can make about sort of their personal impact. When it comes to sort of waste management, there has been a big call for diversion of organics from landfills, and in particular, sort of food waste and composting. I would put a little caution in there in that composting can be aerobic or anaerobic. And as Dr. Shindell was saying, those anaerobic microorganisms will emit methane as they are digesting the organic waste, but composting facilities can be managed for that. And so it still is probably at the end of the day, much better to divert that organic waste than letting it get layered into giant landfills. And so I think, either composting in your own home or checking to see what your local rules are about diverting organics from your landfills. And if you don't have those local rules, maybe asking why not could be a good start. And then I guess since I began and have been mostly stressing oil and gas, certainly our reliance on fossil fuels is a big piece of this. I think we see some amount of fossil fuels persisting to mid-century, even under some of our Paris compliant projections, hopefully with most of that being captured, the combustion being captured, but we see a lot of methane side effects from fossil fuel production. And so reduction of our reliance on those fuels would certainly help the situation as well.
Do you want to add anything to that, Professor Shindell?
Yeah, I do think that sectors that are difficult to deal with, like agriculture, changing diet to rely less on cattle-based foodstuffs, beef and dairy, is helpful. And there it's something where, as Professor 𝐏𝐏 was pointing out, governments treat that as kind of a third rail, and it's hard to see a lot of action coming from the US government. The Europeans are very similar in that, it's very difficult for them to tackle farm subsidy reform. And so I think there is a role there. I guess the one thing I often find difficult is, there's certainly a role for individual choice, and people can, choose an electric vehicle over a gas-powered vehicle, and certainly these things help. But that's a particular case that highlights how government needs to facilitate making the choices possible. And so, without government support for battery research and electric vehicle charging stations and such, consumers didn't have a choice. For decades, we've all driven gas-powered cars or nothing. And right now, we don't have a choice in much of the country over where we get our electricity from. And so we cannot say, I want renewables, and then we don't have all of this gas power, right? We can, and it's helpful, if you're replacing your kitchen stove, yes, get an induction, it's electric instead of gas. But I would say that one of the main things that we can do is recognize that it is not correct to put all the responsibility on individuals. And it really is the fossil fuel companies and governments that need to take action. And so individuals can make sure that they vote for representatives who take the problem of climate change seriously.
Terrific. So that leads naturally to my last question for the two of you. What is your best hope for the upcoming COP26 conference? Start with you, Professor Shindell.
Well, let's see. I have a long history of making climate projections and none whatsoever making political projections. So I would not know, but I definitely, I am hopeful that there will be progress on more countries committing more forcefully to net zero carbon targets over the long term. I think we already have several doing that, and several major emitters, including both China and the United States. So that is encouraging. We need a lot more follow through and a lot more details on how much reductions will be in the nearer term. So that would be progress on CO2. I think given the state of affairs right now, we're not likely to see nearly as much progress as we need on CO2, but we can be hopeful that more and more parts of the world will announce net zero targets and begin to follow through with mechanisms to reach them. But in the methane space, we are up to more than 50 countries supporting this new global methane pledge launched by the United States and the European Union, including 9 of the top 20 emitters. And so what I'd really hope is to get that number, in particular of the top 20 emitters, up by several and getting it, closer to 20 than to 10. And then I would really regard that as a really a monumental win for climate by having brought methane not just to the table, but to really got substantial pledges for rapid action by most of the major emitters of the world.
Fantastic. Professor 𝐏𝐏𝐿?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to Drew's comments. I am really going to be focused on the methane part of this COP. I think that's where there is momentum. I've been really heartened by that number slowly ticking up on the EU-US methane pledge, or at least their kickoff, and the number of countries that have been joining. I hope they continue to join in the next 2 weeks. I think there's been a lot of really interesting work done by the United Nations Environmental Program and Global Methane Initiative, and sort of thinking about how to more robustly account for methane emissions, so we're more confident of how much there actually is being loaded to the atmosphere, which is a good starting point for then knowing how much we are reducing. And so, yeah, that's where I'm going to be really focused, and where I think I've got the most hope and optimism for this particular conference of parties.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you especially to Drew Shindell and 𝐏𝐏𝐿 𝐏𝐿 for sharing your perspectives. Much appreciated. If you'd like to attend future Duke media briefings, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, please stay well, and thank you.